All right, hey everyone, welcome to this month Visual Builder Office Hour. This month, we're going to focus on the new Oracle Jet Dynamic Components and what you can do with them. We'll do a deep dive, show you a demo, and cover the various components that you can use and some techniques around how to use them. My name is Shai Schmelzer, part of the product management, and with me also is Bino, who will be able to cover the Q&A. So while I'm doing the presentation, you can see there's a Q&A icon there. You can go in there and ask questions about dynamic components, and Bino will be answering those throughout the session. Bino is actually the product manager in charge of the dynamic components, so she'll be able to answer all your questions over there. If you have other non-dynamic components questions, you can post them there. We might want to address them later on during the presentation. All right, so what are the dynamic components? So the dynamic components are a new capability in Oracle Visual Builder. It's been introduced in version 2107 that came out a couple of months ago. They rely on having your application using Oracle Jet 10 or higher, and the VB runtime needs to be 2107, which is the version that comes with the latest release of Visual Builder. So if your application is currently on an older version of the Jet or VB runtime libraries, you would want to first upgrade to the newer version, which is under your system settings, and then you'll be able to use these components. The components themselves are available through the component exchange that is built into Visual Builder. So you can go over there, look up dynamic components, and you will find several of those over there. Why would you want to use dynamic components? So what did we create them for? So the idea is that in a lot of cases, when we create user interfaces, we need to dynamically change what we're showing or how we're showing things based on all sorts of conditions. Okay, and you can do this programmatically, writing code, using maybe a bind if component and things like that, but we were looking for something that would allow us to do it in a more declarative way. So the idea is that you can now create a page, and the page would be customized based on condition, and you will define the conditions and the customization of the page in a declarative way rather than by coding everything in your page HTML or JavaScript. We're actually using those components quite extensively inside Oracle when we're developing our cloud applications, when we're developing our SaaS offering. Those components are actually heavily used over there. And one of the things they allow our customers down the line is to customize the pages that we deliver in an easier way, just using Visual Builder again and playing with those dynamic components. Which dynamic components are you going to see? You're going to see three main dynamic components: a dynamic table, dynamic form, and a dynamic container. The table shows a table of data, the form shows a form of data, and the container allows you to dynamically decide what's going to be inside an area of your page. The components are also relying on two other supporting components, the field binding and the section binding, which are used by those three components. So when you would search for dynamic components in the component exchange, you would actually see 5 components out there, but you basically only need to add 3 of those, and the other ones would be added automatically for you. Beyond having the components in the component exchange, we also built a new editor and a new section into the Visual Builder and the Visual Builder Studio development environment. So there's a new area there on the menu on the left, which handles all the definitions. So this is the place where you handle all the definitions of the dynamic components and how they're going to display and what they're going to display. So you would see this area on the left side. Over there, you would see editors for rules, templates, and fields. And also what you're going to see is you're going to see a few new quick starts to allow you to bind the components to data, to connect, for example, a table or a form to the data. By the way, for the form, again, we have a create, edit, and details forms in terms of quick start. And one of the nice things with that is that it allows you to create, for example, a form on a page with a quick start without having to first drop a table or a list and then have those wizards. Those wizards are now available for you directly with the dynamic component. So the first thing you're going to do is define the layout of the component. So maybe instead of showing this in a slide, let's cover what we talked about so far in the tool, and we'll show you how to get started. So you go into Visual Builder like you do every day, and we're going to create a new web application. We'll call this the dynamic application. I'm going to choose just the basic 3 items navigation here at the top, and you go into the visual editor just as normal. Now, again, the components are not in the list of the components over here right now, okay? But you can add them either by clicking the Get Components here or by going to the Component Exchange over here. It's the same action, actually. And then from here, again, there's a lot of components over here, and you should look those up and learn about each one of them because they can be useful in your application development. We're going to look for Jet Dynamic components. And as you can see, we have the 5 components we mentioned before. And in order to add them to a specific application, you just click Install. Okay. You can read, of course, the license, accept the license for each one of those. And I'm going to add each one of the 3 main components to my application over here. Once the components have been added to my application, I can actually minimize that area. If you scroll down at the bottom of the list, you'll see the 3 components down here. Okay. So now let's go over to our page, and we'll divide it using a panel. So we'll drop a panel here, resize it a little bit, and drop another panel next to it over here. And now you can actually drag and drop components just like you do any regular components. For example, if I drag the dynamic table over here, okay, it would place the component on the page, and you can see we have a quick start for this component, which allows us to configure the dynamic UI component. And when we click on it, this would take us into the regular binding dialog that we have for binding a table into data. So right now I only have business object in my application, so I can pick up one of those business objects. And when I click next, this is where we start going into the actual new functionality of dynamic components by creating what we call a rule set. Okay. So let's create the emp table rule. Okay, that's a rule set. And then what you can choose is you can choose which fields you want to show. So again, we're going to use something like the name, the salary, job, we'll take the ID, and we can also include a picture. Okay. So you define the fields. Again, you can move fields around, so reposition them, click next. Again, you can define the filter criterion, for example, to filter the records, things like that. And we'll click finish, and this would get us the data into the table. Okay. Now, the one new thing that you would notice in our editor is in the menu over here on the left, we now have this section called Dynamic UI. If I'll expand it and I click on the employee object, you would find the employee table rule that we defined for the dynamic table, and we can click on it and see the rule. Okay. So let's go back into the slide for a second and talk about what we defined so far. Okay. So the first thing that you usually define for a rule is the layout. So you're going to define which fields in what order are going to be displayed. You can also control the various properties of each field. Okay. One other thing you can do is you can actually override the template for a field. So let's look at that in our application. Okay. So again, if we look at the UI, we can see the fields, and we can see, for example, that the picture field is showing up as text, and we might want to change that behavior. So if we go back into the layout, so each rule here has a layout, we can open the layout, and this basically shows us the fields that we marked. And for each field, we can see properties here that we can update. One of the properties, we'll take the picture, for example, is the template that is being used to show the field. And right now, the template is none. So we basically just show the field as is. But we can create a specific template. Let's call this one, for example, a picture template. Okay. This will take us into an editor. Again, it's under the employees, but under the template section over here, we can design our way of showing a specific field. So for example, we can say we want to use an avatar component, drag and drop it over here. And this would be the component that we're using. We can then set, for example, the size, take a large avatar, and then we want to show a specific value in here. So if we go for the source property and we pop up our variable inspection, what you would see here is that you have access to something called the value, as well as component context and a byte of other information. Okay. The interesting thing for us usually is the value, because that's the value of the field. Now this item is connected to whatever the value is. And if we keep it like that for a second and go back to our page right now, you can see now that we are showing, okay, we don't have enough space here, but we're showing both the text and the image on the right and the title as well. Okay, so we know that we don't actually need all of those, so we can go back to our template and we can take this area that shows the title and the value and just remove those from our template. Okay, so now we just left here our avatar component, which is hidden because we don't have an image. But if we go back to our page over here, now we're actually seeing the picture. Okay. So this is how you can define a template for a field to show it with a different component. Again, the default is just an input text or a regular text, and then you can modify it just by adding new UI components and again, modifying their behavior. For example, we can again switch it to medium, and then we'll get a smaller image. Okay. The other thing that you can do, as we mentioned, is the layout that you're using right now. If we navigate back to our rule set, and we're looking at a specific, at the default layout, we can change the order, so we can move the picture to be first, and then in our page, the picture would be first. Okay. So this is how you bring in a component and define a template for the page. The next thing, and what actually makes the dynamic components unique, is this concept of rules. And rules can define the behavior or the display of items based on conditions that you define. Okay. The conditions have access to built-in variable, but also to variables that you can pass to the component. So you can bring in any value that you want, any object that you want, and pass it as a parameter to your dynamic components. And then you define rules that are going to control how we're going to show things based on specific conditions. Those rules are going to be executed in sequence. So from the top bottom, we're going to check the rule. If we match the rule, we're going to use the template that you used to show that component. And one thing you should usually keep is a default rule that is going to be shown in case none of the other rules matched. So let's again see how this is done. So this is our current table, and this is what we're showing on a large device. Now, if we were going into a small device, if we were going, for example, into some mobile phone, you can see that the table now requires us to scroll, which is not very friendly UI on a mobile device. So maybe what we want to do is we want to switch it so the table shows less fields when we're on a smaller device. So if we go back to our rule set for the table, okay, this is the default rule. What we can do is we can create a new rule. One thing that is usually useful, rather than clicking the create, is clicking this little icon, which is duplicate. We're going to duplicate and we're going to create a new mobile layout. Okay. And then we can define a condition. The condition has access to a bunch of variables over here, and some of the variables handle responsive sizing. Other things are, for example, which user is accessing us, whether it's an authenticated user, even what the role of the user is. All of those are things you can access here. And we'll also talk about the component context in a few minutes. But in our case, what we want to check is whether we are on a small device. So whether it's small only, equal, true. That's our condition. By the way, you can add additional conditions. You can do group by of conditions and do and or between them. We're going to keep it simple and ask whether the responsive small only is true, which means we're on a small device. And then we have a new layout instead of the default, which is called the mobile layout. Okay, and click that here. And then we can edit this layout. So again, this is a new layout for mobile. And here we can decide which fields we want to show. So maybe we don't want to show the ID, and maybe we don't want to show the job. So we're only showing picture, name, and salary. Now we can, and again, this is for the table. We now have two rules. If it's small, we're going to show mobile. Otherwise, we're going to show default. Let's go back to our page. This is on a big device, so we can see the full table. If we're now switching to a smaller device, okay, so we might need to run this rather than show it live here. Let me click run. So some of the things now, when you're working with those components, you sometimes need to run the page because the live preview doesn't actually catch the event. So this is our large device. Let's go small. Okay, and you can see the table adjusts. And now the table just shows us just this information. There's no scrolling to the right because the other fields are hidden. Okay, and again, if we go big, okay, you can see the table again changes, shows us the additional fields, and we get the full layout. So this is one nice thing about our dynamic components. It's the ability to define rules, and based on those rules, decide what type of UI we're going to show. So this is the dynamic nature of the component. And again, those rules can be quite complex. You can create, again, another set of rules for example, if we're still in the mobile context, for how you do things on a tablet, okay? The rules don't actually just have to be about which fields we're showing. It can also be how we're showing fields, okay? So we can create, for example, in the mobile rule, we can create a different template for the field to show a smaller image, for example. Right. The other tab that you're going to see in the editor is the Fields tab. And this is, again, where you can define even more rules for your fields and how they are going to be displayed, the default properties for them. And you can also define new custom fields if you want to show a field that is based on some calculation based on the other fields. Okay. So, for example, if we go again back into the editor, when you're looking at the rules over here, you also have the Field tab. And in the Field tab, you can go to each one of the fields and you can see their properties. Okay, so for example, you can change the default label for a field. So we can call this first name. Okay, instead of name, this is the label. Then if we go again over here and reload the page, previously it said name. Now we're going to reload to see the new values. Okay, and now it says first name, and it's going to apply both in the big screen. And if we go to small screen, still going to say first name. Okay, so this is how you can control properties of fields. And again, in the same place, by the way, you can go over and create a new custom field. I'll call it title, for example. Okay. And the value for this one can be a calculation. So in the calculation, you would have access to the various fields and you can add them over here. So for example, you can pick up the name and you can add to it something like the grade. Okay. So this is a new field we defined called title. if we go back to our rule set and we go to the default layout in the big table, we can now check this title field, add it in here, and move it up here and remove the name. And then if we go back here and do a reload, we would now have the name plus the grade showing at the end. Right? Yeah, we picked the wrong calculation over there, but that's the idea over there for how you configure your own fields. And again, you can use their expression language to configure the exact calculation. All right, the next thing we want to talk about, display template. We actually showed that already, the ability to customize the look and feel of a field. And then the component context. Okay, so let's do, before we go into the context, which is a little bit more complex, let's cover a little bit more of functionality in our page. Okay, so we showed you so far how you work with the table. Let's also show you how to work with a form over here. Okay, so the table, by the way, is like a regular table, has a bunch of properties, okay, that you can search for. So we can, for example, edit the selection mode of the table and do a single row selection on the table. Okay, and then we can have events on the table. So we can define a new event, and it's all the regular events that you have on a table. So for example, for a select, you have the first selected row event, and you can define an action chain on this selection row. Okay, and for example, when we select a row in the table, we want to keep a variable on our page that would be the selected AMP ID, for example. So that would be a variable that we want to assign from the first selected row, and this would be under the data, and it would be the ID field. Okay, so now we have a little variable that holds the value of the selected row in a table. Okay, and that would be the value of the ID field. Now that we have a variable that actually has an ID, one thing we can do is, again, go over to our UI components, pick up the dynamic form, and bring it into the right side of the page. Okay, so again, once we drop a dynamic form, you get a quick start on that allows you to either do a create form, an edit form, or a detail form. So let's do an edit form, for example. We'll pick the same employees object again, okay, and then we are going to define a rule set for the form. So we're going to call this one the AMP form rule set, okay. And again, just like before, you can choose which fields you want to show, including the new field that we had here. And we'll do just these fields over here, like that. And again, decide on the order, things like that. Next. And now the thing that you're going to see in this wizard is that when you're doing a form, you need to provide usually an ID in order for us to know which record to fetch. So we're going to pick up the selected employee and bring it as a value over here for the get operation. So we'll be able to get this employee. There's also an update employee because we created an update form. So we also need the ID to be mapped over here. Finish. All right, so now we have a page that has both a table and a form next to it. Okay, so the form initially doesn't show anything, but once we select an employee, let's go to live mode, we'll select an employee, we'll get the details of the employee on the right side. So again, we have the picture at the top, and we want it to show differently. So we are going to go to our rule sets for employees. We have the rule set for a form. Okay, and this is the default rule set. We can go over to edit the layout. We can go over to the picture and switch the template to the template we already created for a picture. Okay, or create a new one, whatever we want. Go back to our page. Okay, click on an employee, and now we include the image in. And again, this is a fully functioning page. So if we run, again, if we run this page over here, we'll do a reload. Okay, and if we click on an employee, and we update their salary and click save, this would update their salary over here. We probably need to do a refresh on the table. So we can add it in the event, in the save button event, or we can just do a refresh here just to show you. This is going to bring in the new value, the 4,000 for James. So we actually save the data over here. All right. And again, if you want to update the table itself can have property, right? So it has an ID, so we'll call it my table, like that. And then we can go to the save button. It has an event. And again, the save button was created for us by the component. In here in the event, after we save the employee, if it was successful, we can add a component event and then call our table and invoke a refresh on the table. So now that should be, again, if we go and reload our page over here, that would take care of actually updating the data in the table the minute that we do the change in the form. Okay, so if we go to Chris, update his salary to be 3,000, for example, click save, and the data is also updated in the table. Right. So this is how you can create a form. Now, as I said, one of the nice things about a form is that you can create forms that are created not just on Business Object, but also on REST services, and you can create them without first having to drop a table. So we all know that when you drop a table, you have a quick start to bind the table, but also to create the various CRUD operations on that. Let me show you what happens if I go over for a second into my URL to REST service. So let's pick up this REST service URL. Okay, and we'll create a connection to this REST service. Okay, this one gets me information about a single country based on a code. For example, if I put here US and test this, you'll see data about the US. I can save this as an example set of data and click create. So now I have a REST service that I can use here. Okay. And let's go back to our application. In our application, we worked on this page. Now let's go over and work on the item 2 page. Okay. So again, we're starting with a blank page over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to drop a dynamic form on the page. Actually, before we drop a dynamic form, let's first drop an input text. Okay. So this would allow us to put in like a country. Okay. We'll bind this to a variable. Okay. Call it country code. All right, and now we can drop the form over here. All right, and again, we have various types of form we can create. We're going to create the detail form. Now we have also access to the REST endpoint that we defined here. Okay. And we're going to define a rule set. Now in the rule set for the country, okay, we have all the fields that are being returned from this REST endpoint. So for example, we can pick up the capital and the flag and what else is interesting, the area of the country and the name of the country, of course, and which region it's in. And what's the native name, for example. Okay, and again, we can move the, not the region, actually, let's move the name to the top. Over here. Okay, and click next. And again, we need to pass in a parameter to the REST service of which country we want to fetch. This would be the country code. Bring it in here, click finish. And again, if we now type US over here, it's going to go fetch data and bring it into the form. Just like before, the flag over here is an image. So we should probably switch this one to be an image-based display. So in our layout, okay, for the flag field, again, we can switch the template. And let's create a new template for this one. And call it the flag template. and we can use, for example, an image component here. So that's not what I was expecting here. Right. We'll set it to be 300 by 200, and the data would be our value. Okay. Let's see if this actually works. Something here was a little suspicious. Okay, I think I did something wrong in my definition. Let's go back here. Oh yeah, I did it for the wrong place. Okay, sorry. I was aiming to do on this flag, create a new template. Nope, there we go. Yeah, okay, so we need the image, put it here, set it to be 300 by 200, and set the data to come from our value. And then again, we don't need this field, so we can delete this one. Let's go back to our item. I don't know if I messed up something in my other page. Yeah, it seems like I did something wrong. Okay, so let me quickly do this part again. Okay, so we'll remove the dynamic form, okay, from here, and just drop a new form here. Okay, so we do a detail form, hook it up to our REST service, and we'll do a new layout, country form 2, choose the fields that are interesting to us, capital, population, region, area, alpha code, for example. Okay. Rearrange them. We can take, actually that's a good order right now. Pass the variable, so the country code gets over here. Let's make sure that this one actually works. Okay, and then we wanted to go into our UI, the rule set for this one, the country form 2. We can delete this rule set. Okay, go into the layout, go into the flag, and choose the flag image template. Right, so that should be it. Now we can go over here, and if we type US, we're going to get the flag. Type another country, getting that flag and all the details over there. So again, this is a very nice, easy way to create a form that then is based on some source of data, and all the fields are already created for you with this wizard. You can easily change the layout. And again, this is a form component. So even though it's a dynamic form, it still has a bunch of properties that you can set for it. For example, you can set how many columns you want to see here. So you can have 2 columns where you have things on the left and then things on the right. Or you can even have 3 columns if you really want to organize things like that. Okay. So this is the basics of how you use a form. I wanted to show you also one more thing, which is how you pass in parameters to the dynamic component to control what's going on. So first of all, in our rules over here for a form, if we go back over here to the rule set, okay, again, if we were to create a duplicate rule, okay, and let's create a specific rule, for example, for US, okay, okay, and we can define a condition here. One of the things that you can check is you can, in a form, you can actually check each one of the values of the data that you're getting, okay? So for example, we can use the alpha2 code value, okay? And we can say if it's actually the US, okay, then we want to have a specific layout for the US. For example, maybe we want to move the flag to be the first thing, okay? So again, if we run our little application, and we'll switch to the second tab now. Okay, and we'll type the US. Okay, you can see the flag is the first field. If we type in a different country, okay, the flag is now the second. So one of the things is you can actually handle and control aspects of displaying things in the form based on values in the form. Okay, so you have access to each one of the values in those fields over here. But you can also pass in parameters to those components. So if we go back to our page, and we'll get some data in there so we can actually see the form. Okay, so the form itself as a dynamic component, one of the properties that it has is something called context. And context is basically an object that you're passing over to the dynamic component. So this can be bounded into a variable that you define in your page. So we're going to create a variable. This variable needs to be of type object. Okay, so we'll create an object and we'll call it the form context. Okay, so now we have a variable in our page that we are going to pass over to the context of the form. Now, inside this object, we can define various fields. So, for example, we have the form context, and we can add a field. We can, for example, add the show flag field, and we'll make it a Boolean field. Okay. So we have a Boolean item that is part of what we're passing to the dynamic component. Okay. So let's go back to our UI and add a little switch component. I'll switch, put it right here. Okay, call it show flag. Okay, and we're going to hook it to the data from our context to the show flag property. Okay, so this can be true or false. And this is being passed into our dynamic form. So now we can reference it in our dynamic layout. Okay, in the rule set for the form, okay, let's adopt this US rule and instead create a new rule, and we'll ask it show flag. That's the name that we're going to give it. It's going to create a show flag layout, and the condition here is going to be if the context, and then we know there's a show flag attribute in there, so over here, dot show flag. If this is false, okay, we don't want to show the flag. So we're going to go to the layout and we're going to remove the flag. Okay. Again, if you look at the rule set, if it's not false, we're going to go to the default layout, which does show the flag. Okay. So again, if we go to our little page, do a refresh here. Okay. Bring in a country, okay, and then start to play with the value over here. Okay, if it's false, it's going to hide the flag. If it's true, it's going to show the flag. Okay, so based on a variable that we defined in our page, what we call a context, we can control what is going to be shown in the page or how things are going to be shown. It's basically a value from the page that you bring into dynamic component. Okay. Again, the value needs to be an object. Inside it, you can have as many fields as you want, name them anything you want, and then you can reference them from inside the dynamic components. So that's the way for the dynamic components to communicate with the containing page. All right, so one thing to be aware of. What we're doing here, a lot of people are tempted to use it for security aspects. For example, you might want to hide a field based on the role of a user. So it's actually pretty easy to do. Okay, if we would go to our application and in the application setting, we're going to define 2 user roles. We're going to create a manager's role, and we're going to create another role, which we'll call EMPS role. Okay. And then we want to control whether, for example, in a page, let's create a 3rd page in our application. We'll go to the 3rd flow that we have here. And we'll bring in an input text. Okay. And we'll bind it to a variable, we'll call it the EMP ID. Okay. And then we'll drop a dynamic form. So we'll take a dynamic form, drop it on the page. We'll do an edit form on the employees, and we're going to show edit EMP form rule. Again, we're going to show most of the fields here. That with the salary, actually, we'll do the salary as the 2nd field here, and we're going to pass in the employee ID. All right. Yes. Next. We're missing something. Oh yeah. So the employee ID was okay. It was a string, and we need it to be a number. All right. So let's just hard code employee number 2 over here. That's gonna work. Oh, sorry. No, it's not that. It should not. Okay. Forgot to do it both here and in here, like that. All right. Now we have the finish. Okay. So now if we go into live mode, and we bring in employee number 2, we get the details of employee number 2. Now, some people might be tempted to say, okay, only managers can see the salary of employees. So an easy way to handle this would be to go into the rules that we have for employees. Okay, we're looking for the rule set for the EMP edit form. Okay, and we can add a new rule over here. So we'll do a duplicate here. We'll say, for example, managers, or actually let's do this. We'll do, if you're an EMP, so employees, the condition is if the role of the user over here include EMPs, okay, we're going to do a layout that doesn't show, for example, the salary. Okay. So now if we go back to our UI, okay, we're going to run this page as a manager for a second. Okay. We'll put in a code of an employee. We will see the salary. Okay. If, on the other hand, we were to run this page as an employee, someone who's in the employee role, we put in a value. You can see that the salary is hidden. We're not actually showing it. So that's an easy way to hide fields in the UI based on the role. However, one thing that we want you to keep be aware of is that that's not actually a secure solution, okay? For a couple of reasons. The first reason is that fields are fetched even if they are not shown in a specific layout. So if you were to run this page over here and you'll open the inspection to see the network traffic, and we'll go to the 3rd page that we designed, okay, and we'll clear everything here and then fetch the details of an employee, okay? And if you would look over here at the data that is being fetched, we're actually fetching all the data about an employee, including the salary, okay, in the field. So the response does include the salary, even if it's not shown here, okay? And that's the reason that you shouldn't rely on hiding fields based on roles to hide secured information, okay? The other thing in general is that having those types of rules only on the UI side is an open door for hackers. They can usually come in, modify values on the client and resubmit the query and get things over. So whenever you're dealing with security, security should be done on the backend and only return the information that you want over to the client. But in order to control aspects of your UI dynamically, the dynamic components are great. Again, hiding, showing fields that don't relate to security, modifying the orders of fields, modifying how fields are shown. The dynamic components are there to help you. So this was a quick introduction to dynamic components and the basic functionality that you can get out of them. We also have other resources for you to learn about dynamic components, including our Visual Builder Cookbook. If you go to vbcookbook.oracle.com, we have 4 new examples of using dynamic components. Again, if you go over to vbcookbook.oracle.com, from the homepage of our cookbook, we now have a section for dynamic component and 4 different samples of how to use each component, including the container that we didn't have time to cover today. Okay. Again, it allows you to toggle how you show things in an area of the page. Okay. Remember, the cookbook also comes with a full code, so you can actually create a copy of the cookbook in your environment, look at all the code and see how to use it. On our blogging page on blogs.oracle.com/vbcs, we have 3 blog entries that were published over the last month about the dynamic components. We have an intro that I wrote and 2 in-depth entries that Bino wrote on how to use the components, how to pass the context over. So if things weren't clear in this session, you can read more over there and get more ideas. We also have a section in our documentation about the dynamic components. If you go to the docs.oracle.com site, look up Visual Builder, then under the design page part of the how to build web applications, there's a whole section that explains the dynamic components in a little bit more details than what we had time to cover today. All right, so hopefully this has been useful for you. You learned some new things. Again, if you want to learn more, our docs, our blog are always there. We have our Cloud Customer Connect forums. If you have any questions about the dynamic components that we didn't answer today in the Q&A, feel free to go over to there and ask those. As a reminder, we have a LinkedIn group as well. We would love you to join our LinkedIn group. So go to LinkedIn, search Oracle Visual Builder. You'll find our group, sign up to be a member there. We post about every new blog that we write, every new white paper, every event that we have, like the event today. We post notifications over there to keep you in touch. And there are also people looking for jobs, of course, over there. So people who are looking to hire Visual Builder developers are hanging out there, and you can maybe find your next career path over there. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Hopefully this has been a useful session for you. Again, if you have any further questions, feel free to ask them on the Q&A. And if not, we'll see you in our next event next month. Next month, we're going to cover new features in the next version of Visual Builder, so make sure to attend that event. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.